Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we will be going over the top 10 swap screwed players in Survivor history. Now, this is sort of a follow-up to a video I made a while ago where I talked about the top 10 players that were screwed over by twists. And while technically a trad swap is a twist in itself and was considered the first major twist in Survivor history, I feel like the nature of a trad swap makes it pretty different from other twists that I covered in my previous video. And I feel like there are enough people who were screwed over by trad swaps to where a separate video is warranted. Now, before we get into the actual top 10, I did want to discuss a couple honorable mentions here. First up, we have Silas Gaither from Survivor Africa, the original swap screwed player. And I know people talk about him a lot as one of the most swap screwed players. I mean, he was the leader of the original Samburu tribe. And considering that a trad swap had never happened before and it was never considered a possibility before Survivor Africa, people assumed that he was swap screwed and that he would have done so much better in the game had the swap not happened. However, I think as we saw from what actually happened at the swap, that he really didn't do anything to keep the older Samburus loyal to him. In fact, he actively antagonized them a lot during the early stages of the game, to the point where by the time of the swap, I mean, he was swapped with both Frank and T-Bird, two people that he had actively burned along the way. And when the original Barons approached them about throwing the challenge and then flipping against them, they were willing to go along with it. And I feel like that speaks to how Silas was as a player. The fact that these two older players were willing to flip on him that early in the game, despite this being old school Survivor, and despite this being an era where tribal lines mattered a lot, I think that really speaks a lot to how bad Silas managed those people. And I feel like even if he had gone to the merge, I feel like he would have inspired a similar reaction from the older players where they would have flipped on him anyway, so that the Barons plus those players would have taken out Silas anyway. And through that, Silas would have been taken out anyway. So I feel like because of that, I can't really put Silas on this list, simply because I feel like he probably would not have won the game even if the swap hadn't happened. And plus, I feel like he did more wrong to get flipped on than certain other people, so he didn't quite make the list for me. Next up, I did consider Bubba Sampson from Survivor Vanuatu, who was in the majority early on with the Fat Five Alliance, but then obviously he got swapped into a very bad position where he and Rory were the only men on the new Yasser tribe, which was mostly women. And obviously the women were mostly loyal to each other thanks to Amy. So because of that, Bubba and Rory were essentially sitting ducks from that point on. And through that, you could argue that they were swap screw in that regard. But the main reason I didn't put Bubba on the list is I feel like he did more wrong to be voted out first over Rory, where we obviously saw him trying to tell Chris to think of the merge and to throw the challenge. While I could see where he was coming from with making that move, I feel like he didn't handle it in the best way, and it obviously accelerated his target. And plus, I don't think he wins the game even if he had survived and the Fat Five hadn't gone down to that 5, as I feel like Chris would have been in such a great position to win the game from that point on. So I feel like Bubba wasn't setting himself up super well to win the game there. Next up, I did consider Sandra Diaz-Twine from Game Changers, who obviously was swap screwed after the second swap. But the main reason I didn't put her on is she wasn't winning the game. I mean, she already had such a massive target on her back with her being a 2-time winner by that point. And yes, while it was impressive that she was able to at least survive to the second swap, I feel like no one was really willing to take her to the end from that point on. And really, I feel like she didn't really have much of a path forward beyond that point. So I didn't really consider her. And the final honorable mention I have here is Rick Devens from Edge of Extinction, who was swap screwed in that he was basically swapped with all of his original tribe members, minus Wendy, who would have been the next to go off his original tribe. And when that tribe lost the next challenge, he was just the next boot because of that. So really unlucky circumstances there that caused Devens to be taken out there. But obviously the main reason he's not on the list is he comes back in the game and makes a pretty deep run after that. So I feel like inherently just him getting a second chance was enough to keep him off the list. Though if this were a season that did not have Edge of Extinction and he didn't come back in the game, I probably would have put him on the list. And those are the honorable mentions, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the top 10. So starting off at number 10, and I did debate with this placement as I'm not entirely sure this person was swap screwed per se, but they were voted out at the first opportunity following a swap. But here we have Rourke Luskin from HHH. And Rourke was in an interesting spot early in the game. She was obviously in the majority to begin out. And even coming into the swap, she was in an interesting spot where you had two heroes in Chrissy and JP, you had two hustlers in Allie and Ryan, and then you have her as the sole healer in that group. And theoretically, she should have been the swing vote, or at least one would think. However, we did see her like lose that position over the course of the round, where she does align with Allie, and they tried to target Chrissy with Ryan as the remaining vote there. But obviously, she failed to pick up that Ryan and Chrissy had built this very close bond that caused Ryan to ultimately flip against her, sending her out despite her seeming to be in the swing position. So it's sort of a weird way for her to go out here. However, I feel like the main thing that put her above someone like a Bubba is I feel like she didn't do as much wrong to be voted out. And plus, I felt like she is someone who could have had more of a path moving forward. Now, realistically, do I think she would have won? I don't think it's super likely. But it's just the way in which she went from being in this spot to where she could have been a swing vote to being voted out at the first opportunity that made her kind of stand out to me. And because of that, she is here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9. And I also debated with this person over how well I feel like they would have done had they not been swap screwed. But I did decide to put them on because I felt like they did less wrong to be voted out. But here we have Brendan Shapiro from Survivor Ghost Island. And Brendan did play a pretty solid game through those first two rounds. He was basically a leader figure for the original Malolos and was able to keep that group in line. And even after the swap, I mean, we did see him coming in with a 4-5 disadvantage. But again, he was still able to keep his people on board, and they were a pretty tight group. Obviously, the problem is that the original Levites were also pretty tight as well, and they targeted Brendan because he was obviously one of the bigger targets, but also they figured that he was less likely to have an idol played on him, which was pretty unlucky in that regard. And while we did see like Michael attempt to bluff an idol, like with the Survivor China idol, like making it sound like he could play on two people, the Navides did not fall for it, and Brendan was voted out there. So again, he was a pretty solid player, voted out the first opportunity. Also got pretty unlucky with how early in the game the swap happened, where they literally swapped after only 2 rounds, which obviously promoted like original tribes sticking together as there had been less time for cracks to form. So I feel like in that regard, Brennan also got unlucky. And it's for that reason I did at least have him on this list. But the main reason I don't have him higher is, again, it was still pretty early in the game. And plus, given how big of a target he was from even that early on, I do question whether he would have been in it for the long haul, as I could have seen him being targeted later on regardless. And I feel like Brennan is someone who would have emerged as this natural leader figure, this natural big threat. So I can't really have him higher on the list because of that, but I was still impressed by him. And plus, I feel like he did less wrong to be swap screwed. So because of that, he is here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we actually have another person from Ghost Island here. But here we have Stephanie Johnson. And I did consider putting Stephanie higher, as I feel like she would have had more potential moving forward than Brendan, and I feel like she would have had more ability to navigate the game moving forward. However, the reason she isn't higher on the list is she technically was not voted out at the first opportunity. She was swapped with Brendan. Brendan was obviously voted out first, but then she followed soon after. So I feel like because she wasn't voted out at the first opportunity and she did technically survive a vote, I feel like she wasn't quite as swap screwed as some of the other people we'll be talking about, where I really wanted to prioritize people who were voted out at the first opportunity following their terrible swaps. So I feel like Stephanie not fitting that category makes her a bit lower on the list. But even so, I feel like she was on the same boat as Brendan, where she really got unlucky with the Navides sticking together as much as they did. And while she really fought and tried hard to like get someone to flip, she just was unable to do so and was voted out because of that. So I still put her on the list because I feel like she did less wrong. And plus, it was such a terrible swap that she was really unable to dig herself out of that hole. But it's just the fact that she did at least survive a tribal that makes her a bit lower on the list. And because of that, she's here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7. And from this point on the list, these are all people who were voted out at the first opportunity following their swaps. And now it's just a matter of the order. But at number 7, we actually have the only returning player on this list, or at least a player that would come back from a future season. But here we have Kelly Wentworth from San Juan del Sur. And you could debate whether she was screwed in that she does ultimately get a second chance, albeit on future seasons. But again, I'm just considering her Samuel Del Sur game here. And she did play a good game for a lot of that pre-merge. She was in a decent spot in her early tribe. And yes, while she was being targeted by Drew Christie, I mean, it was Drew Christie, and we really saw like the tribe stick together for her. But then she gets a really bad swap where she is paired up with her loved one, her dad, Dale. And yes, while there were other pairs on that tribe like Baylor and Missy and Jacqueline and John, I mean, she was basically at the mercy of Keith Nail, who was sort of the swing vote in that position. And then obviously once Dale and Kelly become targeted of that group, she really gets brought down with the ship there, where obviously her and Dale are being targeted, and they do choose to go for Kelly over Dale as she was kind of a bigger long-term threat. People recognized her as a better player. So I feel like through that she got really unlucky, both with the swap itself, but also the blood versus water format of the season. But the main reason I don't have her higher is I feel like the way in which she was swap screwed wasn't as blatant as certain other cases we'll be getting to soon. And plus, while it was Drew Christie, you do at the least point out that Drew Christie did clock her and did attempt to target her early on. So really, it's sort of a case where it's definitely good, but not the best. So I can't really have her higher than number 7 here. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we definitely have a more clear-cut case of someone getting screwed over, where they were in a good position early on, they got swapped down the numbers, and they were voted out. But at number 6, we have from Survivor Gabon, Jackie Berg. And Jackie is an interesting case where she was in a good position early on. She was a part of the Onion Alliance along with most of the Kotas. She got swapped into a very bad position where she was down the numbers with Ace and Kelly as the only original people to join there. And yes, while we do see her attempt to get the vote off her, they ultimately choose to vote her out over Kelly. So it's not great there. And you can make a case that she would have done much better had she not been swapped into a bad position. You can also point to how early in the game the swap was, where she was swapped after the 3rd round, so that isn't great there. So on the whole, it's a pretty textbook case of someone being swap screwed. However, the main reason that I don't have her higher is, again, I do question whether she would have won the game had she not been swap screwed, as, yes, while she was in the Onion Alliance, and I do believe that that alliance would have stuck together moving forward and possibly could have gotten down to the final 5. I'm not entirely sure she was set up to win the game, as I feel like the core of that group was Marcus, Charlie, and Corinne. And I feel like with Jackie not being in the very core of that, she probably would have been cut along the way. So it's not a great case here, but the fact that she would have gotten a lot further in the game had she not been swap screwed was enough to have her here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and we have another pretty textbook case of someone getting screwed over here. And here we have Anna Kate from Survivor Co. Wrong. And Anna played a pretty strong game during the early stages of it, where she was a pretty central figure on the beauty tribe. Sure, she was obviously part of that women's alliance, but she also had a pretty strong bond with the Calebs and Julias of the world as well. So I feel like she was pretty strongly positioned there. But then we get to the swap where obviously she's in a very bad position, where obviously the brains hold the majority there. And yes, while Scott's there on his own, like no one really targets him. We obviously see Scott and Ty build a very close bond. So she's basically on the outs from that point. And yes, while Peter isn't trusted very much among the brains, we do see them ultimately stick together, and she's voted out unanimously at that first tribal. Really not good situation there. So on the whole, I feel like Anna's someone who definitely was playing a good game up until the swap. And yes, while I can point to people recognizing her as a big threat and that Scott was more close to Ty by the swap than to her, it's still a game that I feel like was swap screwed in my view. And I feel like Anna is one of these more blatant cases of someone who was in a good position early on, was in a bad position later on through things outside of her control. So because of that, I do have her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, we have someone who's pretty similar to Anna in a lot of ways, but here we have Matt Bischoff from Survivor Karamoan. And Matt was in a very strong position early on. He obviously had that very close bond with Michael Snow, and the two of them were basically in the middle of the tribe, where they were in the middle of the Cool Kids Alliance, but they were also pretty close with Sherry, who was a bit on the outside there. So through that, they were able to control a lot of those early votes. And I feel like Matt was in the driver's seat for a lot of it as well. But then they got a very bad swap. The fans were down the numbers. He was obviously swapped with Michael, who was his closest ally. People recognized that the two of them were a close pair, and obviously they had to be broken up. And obviously, with Michael building the closer bond with people like a Corinne, that did cause them to choose to vote out Matt over Michael. So, not great there. And it's obviously not great that Matt was unable to build the bond that he needed to not beat the target there. But I feel like if we're looking at the game, I mean, he played a very strong game early on. And yes, while you can fault him to a degree for not bonding with more people, you also have to point out to the fact that he was on a fans versus favorite season and he was just down the numbers to where the favorites were obviously sticking together at that point. And really, there was not too much room for Matt to maneuver there. So at the end of the day, I do feel like Matt is one of these more swap screwed players. And it's for that reason that I do have him here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and these top 3 are a bit different from the rest of the list, where obviously all 3 of these players were swap screwed to various degrees, but the main thing that keeps them this high on the list is the way in which the swap played out, to where it was pretty weird and definitely made it so that they were put in a very bad position due to various circumstances. But at number 3, we have from Survivor Fiji, Michelle Yee. Now, I actually got comments on my Twist Screwed Players video saying that Michelle should have been on that list instead, as technically it wasn't a swap, but for all intents and purposes, it was a tribe swap. I mean, yes, they were technically merged at that point, but the twist itself was essentially a tribe swap where the tribe was essentially divided into 2. They competed in the challenge as teams, and then they went to tribal as teams, while the other team did not go to tribal. So it was, for all intents and purposes, a tribe swap. And through that, I considered Michelle Yu to be a swap screwed player more so than a twist screwed player. But if we're taking all that in, I mean, we have to look at the circumstances of her tribe swap, where, I mean, it was a very weird circumstance because, yes, they were already merged and they had obviously already had a tribe swap before. Michelle Yee should have been there in the merge with the rest of the tribe, but it's just through to this last minute decision that caused them to, like, obviously end up on a tribe, and they got screwed over directly because of that. And she was put in a very bad position where she was basically put on a team with all of the 4 horsemen who had no reason to work with her moving forward. And that's a big reason that she is taken out there. And obviously, you look at her position at the time that the swap happened, where she was obviously a key piece in the majority alliance. She was very close to Earl and Yowman, and had the merge played out naturally, she very likely gets to at least the final 5 with Earl and Yowman, along with Cassandra and Dreams. However, the main thing that keeps me from putting her higher is I don't think she wins the game, even if that were the final 5, as I do feel like Earl probably would have sided with Cassandra and Dreams from that point on, and probably would have cut Michelle along the way. And even if Dreams had remained loyal to the 4 horsemen and was taken out earlier than that, I still don't think she wins the game, as she probably would have taken Earl to the end, who she clearly loses to. So really, I don't think Michelle was poised well to win the game, but obviously she was poised well to make a very deep run. And it's just due to this weird twist that was essentially a trade swap that caused her to be taken out as early as she did. And considering how late in the game it happened, to where everyone had been told that they emerged only for this random twist to come into play, couple that with the way the team broke down to where she really had no way out of it, where not only was she down the numbers, but they couldn't even have time to scramble as they went directly to tribal right after the challenge. Michelle was one of the most blatantly swap screwed players in Survivor history, and that's why she is this high on the list. But again, considering her win equity from that point on, I can't really have her higher than number 3 here. Now we're moving on to number 2, and we have another player who I know some people feel like should have been on the Twist Screwed player list, though not to the same degree as Michelle. But here we have, from Survivor China, Aaron Reisberger. And obviously, we have to talk about the way the swap broke down here, where it was incredibly unfair, where the 2 tribes were basically allowed to handpick who they got to, like, pick from the other tribe. And obviously we saw the Young Who members choose to select Aaron and James to go over there. And obviously this is really unfair in that it's not only like handpicked to where obviously the tribes could game who they could send over there, and obviously they choose the strongest member in Aaron and James, but it also makes it so that whoever gets swapped over there is automatically in the minority, which obviously is not always a guarantee in a trade swap. So really, Aaron was just screwed over by this, where the Jonghus recognized that Aaron and James were the strongest members, and we even see like PG and Jamie throwing the first immunity challenge in order to vote out Aaron or James. And obviously they do choose to vote out Aaron first over James, which is again very unlucky and would not have happened had that trade swap played out in a more conventional way. So just the nature in which the trade swap happened makes it so that Aaron is in this high on the list. But obviously, he was also in a good position early on. I mean, he was in the core majority group with Todd and Amanda. Now, granted, I feel like he was probably their figurehead, where I don't feel like they would have taken him to the very end had like things played out naturally. I feel like they probably would have used him as a shield for a bit, but then cut him later on due to him being such this big threat. But again, he was in the majority group. He was closely aligned with the people who were running the game, and he probably would have made a much deeper run had this trade swap not happened. So I feel like mixing that in with just the nature in which the trade swap played out makes him this high on the list. But I feel like the number one person was more likely to win the game had the trade swap not happened. So because of that, they are here at number 2. And now at number 1, the person I believe was the most swap screwed in Survivor history is Marcus Lehman from Survivor Gabon. And Marcus is sort of similar to Aaron in that he was seen as his leader figure for a lot of the game. Although, unlike Aaron, I feel like Marcus was actually the leader of his alliance, whereas I feel like Aaron was simply a figurehead for his group. I feel like Marcus was actually running the game with his Onion Alliance, and through that, he was definitely set up to win the game had he gone to the end. And he obviously gets stymied by this trade swap. Now, obviously, like it was a more traditional trade swap in a lot of ways, but the main reason I feel like it was unlucky is because it was obviously pretty late in the game. All the players thought they were about to merge here, only for them to open the chest at the feast, and obviously it turns out it was just a second trade swap. And obviously Marcus gets put into a pretty bad position there, where he's basically relying on Susie to be the swing vote of this tribal, and obviously he ends up going out in a 3-2 vote, which isn't great. And you do have to fault him to a degree for not having Susie on his side there. But, there are two things going for him. One is his strong position, where, again, he was dominating the game early on. And I feel like he would have won the game had he gotten to the end and was probably poised to get to the end of the game had the game played out naturally and had that round just been a merge. But the other thing is the timing of this swap, where again, it was right before the merge and people were starting to think about like later down the road and taking out these big threats. And I feel like through that, like Marcus was naturally seen as this bigger target. And with this trade swap happening at the time that it did, it gave the opposition an opportunity to not only take out Marcus, but take control of the game, which obviously they do when they take the majority after the merge and they start picking off the old Onion Alliance members. And unlike other people on this list, I feel like he is someone who genuinely could have won the game and had a path forward to win the game had he not gotten swapped into the spot that he did at the time that he did. So I feel like through that, Marcus is the most swap screwed player in Survivor history, and because of that, he is here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now I do want to make more general Survivor content like this moving forward, so you can expect more videos like this moving forward as well, so stay tuned for that. Obviously, I do power rankings of Survivor seasons as they are airing live, so you can stay tuned for that as well. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.